Joining me now is Cosmin Dzsurdzsa from True North. On his expose, he's calling the fertilizer files. Cosmin, thanks so much for joining me. What, I guess, as a fellow access to information journalist, what made you file for these documents? You must have known that they were doing something else or plotting something else behind the scenes.
Right. So this goes back all the way to 2020 when the Liberal government announced their climate plan of that year. And that set these 30% below 2020 levels fertilizer emission reduction targets for the agricultural industry. So I was interested to see the planning process, the reasoning and science that went behind achieving this 30% target, because there's a lot of questions that, well, it looks arbitrary to a lot of people. So we wanted to investigate where they got these numbers from and what they were saying on the inside. Now, the trove we're talking about is about 3,000 pages of access to information documents. And this was actually a preliminary release because the government told me that they were already working on processing these files for another party. Now, I don't know who that other party was, but we were the first to make it public as far as I know. And now we're still waiting for documents that span the year 2022 to see where this program is in its current state.
Cosmin, I think you might have scooped me, but but I'm happy that it was True North that did it. Now, you've broken this down into 3 document dumps because, as you say, there are so many documents. It's so labor intensive to read through them all and then to weed, and you have to physically read through them all to weed through sort of the government back and forth to get the nuggets of gold and what they're really plotting. Now, document package 1, it sort of blows a hole in the Trudeau narrative that these fertilizer targets are just a voluntary thing that good-hearted farmers who don't care about the size of their yield or their input costs are going to do to help fight climate change. Because if farmers didn't adopt these targets voluntarily, they were floating the idea of a carbon tax style scheme. Tell us about this.
Right. So what you're talking about, it's a policy discussion paper. Now, these papers are compiled by, high-level staff within ministries. We're talking about deputy ministers giving all kinds of input. And in that document, there's a section called policy options. And under the policy options, Agricultural Canada says we need to give consideration to a regulatory backstop should these voluntary agreements fail. Now, if you recall, when the government was first introducing the federal carbon tax way back, they were calling it, and still do call it, a regulatory backstop. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying, well, if all else fails, here's our policy measure or tax to make sure that our policy objectives get done. So it's quite stunning that the government internally is seriously considering this. And my question would be, is there a plan for this? Is there a drafted a law or potential bill that has been worked on? And I think that's something I will be looking into. But for a while and throughout this whole time they've been introducing these emission reduction targets, the government has maintained that this is voluntary, but internally they're considering otherwise.
And they're telling you, if you say that it is never going to be voluntary, they're accusing you of fake news and misinformation. They do it all the time. They say one thing in public and say another thing behind closed doors, which is why I love access to information. You get down to the heart of the matter. You cut through the spin and the talking points to see what they're really actually scheming. Now, part 2 of the fertilizer files, I think, is probably the most frightening for non-farmers and terrible for consumers, especially as we are trying to struggle our way through an inflationary crisis. Part 2 of the fertilizer files documents that the federal government was aware that these fertilizer emission targets would, first of all, like so many of their bad policies, target Western Canada, because we are where you use these fertilizers, and that it would ultimately if you harm the yield, then the cost of the consumer is driven up in the grocery store. Tell us about this.
Right. So, first of all, I'd like to make the point that a 30% reduction in nitrogen emissions in the agricultural industry on a global level is minuscule, if not negligible. It's not going to do anything realistically to the pollution levels. So it's quite astounding that they're willing to sacrifice yields, and by yields we mean essentially areas throughout Canada that produce a large amount of agriculture, particularly the prairies in Western Canada, where like over almost 100% of Canada's canola gets produced, and that all gets pretty much exported. All that stuff is threatened by this, because if those farmers, which already use low amounts of nitrogen fertilizer because of regional conditions like arid topography and different climate conditions, if they do any sort of reduction, it will impact their yields. It's like a thin hair of the amount of change that they could possibly make. And doing a 30% reduction is quite astounding, because the government insists, well, no, on the one hand, they're telling farmers we need to become a global competitor in the agricultural industry and to feed the world that is ballooning in population. And on the other hand, they're saying you have to make these reductions. So it's absolutely nonsensical. They haven't explained themselves properly to farmers and industry groups, and it just makes no sense.
It's like these people have never actually met a farmer. It's like they think we're just out there with a garden hose spraying fertilizer all over the place because we need something to do. Farmers are very concerned about input costs, especially as the carbon tax is added to our inputs. We are price takers, not price setters in the world market. So if you want to maximize your profit, you have to manage your input costs. And one of those input costs is fertilizer. If you use too much fertilizer, it cuts into your bottom line on the other side. Again, I stress, it's like the people at Agri-Food Canada have never talked to a real farmer. But on the flip side, these are export crops largely. We're talking about canola. We developed canola, but we're also the world's largest exporter of canola. Pulses, beans, legumes, these are portable proteins that store well dry, and we export them to the developing world because they're cost affordable for people in the developing world. And this is not only are we sacrificing Canadian farmers on the altar of climate change, Western Canadian farmers by and large, but we're also sacrificing poor people in the developing world because we are making their food way too expensive.
Right. And it's not only canola, we're also talking about wheat and barley grains.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I think it was last year, I wrote a story about Agriculture of Canada labeling Canadian wheat and barley farmers as the worst offenders when it comes to agricultural emissions. And that is quite astounding, because Canada has some of the best fertilizer use among the agricultural industry when it comes to limiting emissions and reducing environmental impact compared to other parts of the world like China and India. So it must be, from a farmer's perspective, quite insulting to see this government label you in such a derogatory fashion, completely overlook the hard work that has been put over the last, couple decades into making our farms more sustainable. And I've spoken to farmers groups and farmers themselves, and they're open to making to protecting their environment. Robert Sake from an agricultural consultancy group told me, the key to producing good soil and reducing emissions is also growing good crops, and Canadian farmers are already doing that, especially in Saskatchewan. Yet the government has ignored this and is pushing this, as a matter of fact, arbitrary target onto them to achieve some sort of ideological policy agenda so they can check off that box.
That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day Then I interview a fascinating guest either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. You know, we rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.